Welcome, Dr. Michael Pakaluk. For our viewers, Dr. Michael is a professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America. He received his PhD from Harvard, and his expertise includes subjects like Akash philosophy, ethics, Aristotelian ethics, virtue ethics, and political philosophy, among others. He has authored many papers and three books related to Aristotelian ethics. Aristotelian ethics. I think I messed up the word there. Dr. Michael, you've got quite the resume and experience in classical philosophy. So, my first question is, what were the driving factors which led you to dedicate your life studying and teaching philosophy?
You asked how I got interested in philosophy originally.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of students who go to college, they take courses, they figure out what they can major in, and they pick maybe something that they like or something they think they can make money in. I was very different from that. When I was around 13 or 14 years old, I was raised in a nominally Catholic household. My parents didn't practice the faith or go to church. But in my bedroom, there was a Bible. And I don't know, it was like attraction. Like, what is this thing? It's in leather, right? It's a special book. It probably had gold leaf on the outside, right? So what is this thing? And I would thumb through it. And what I was really drawn to were the passages in the Psalms and in the so-called wisdom books, which like Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, the Proverbs, which praised wisdom and exhorted young men, especially, to seek wisdom. And it's finer than gold. It's the most precious thing you can seek, and so on. And you could say, well, why? From the fact that you picked a book off off the shelf and you read it, did you believe that that was so? I mean, that's a very interesting question, right? So in this notion of kind of what you intuitively think is so. And I was raised on Long Island, like Hicksville, Long Island, a suburb of New York City, a typical crass, American culture. And how is this 13-year-old boy in his bedroom picking up a Bible and becoming convinced just because it's written on the page that wisdom is the most precious thing and he should seek that above all? But I was completely convinced by that, right? So then that's what I said, okay, this is what I need to do. I need to seek wisdom. And I gather this is kind of the purpose of your podcast, really, right? So in a certain sense, you picked the right person for this podcast. So that's how it all started for me. So somehow I found out that philosophy means love of wisdom. If you break it up into its Greek roots, it means love of wisdom. So I said, okay, well, I love wisdom. That's philosophy. That's what I need to pursue. Because I want to devote myself to finding out what wisdom is. So that was my next step. And my mom used to take me to the local public library, and we'd go and borrow books and so on. And so one day, I think I surprised her. I said, are there any books here on philosophy? Because that's what I'm really interested in. Right. And so we went to the back then it was card catalog, there were no computers or anything, card catalog. We looked at the section. I wandered to that part of the library, and lo and behold, I'm astonished to find that there's shelves and shelves and shelves of books on philosophy. And first of all, that's astonishing. So, here in the public library of Hicksville, Long Island, there are books and books and books on the most precious thing in the world, right? And then secondly, there's nobody there getting any of these books or reading these books. So that also astonished me. You have books on philosophy and nobody is coming here to read these books? What's going on here? So I just kind of randomly picked books off of the shelf. And one of my first books was Bertrand Russell, believe it or not. And he was arguing for a sense data theory of the perception of the external world, which is that there are no real substantial material objects. They're just understood as logical constructions of sense data. And I became persuaded of that. Very impressionable 13 or 14-year-old boy. And I remember I like to say or joke that once my mom came down the stairs to serve me lunch or breakfast, and I looked at her and I said, she's nothing but a bundle of sense data. And so that was my first realization in philosophy, that my mother didn't exist. She was a bundle of sense data. So I like to say that Bertrand Russell murdered my mother. So that's how I got started in philosophy. So then when I was very good in natural science, and when I went to college, to Harvard College, I thought maybe I would become pre-med, because medicine looked like a pathway where you could do a lot of good for people. And but I just didn't like the whole scene of the pre-med students who didn't seem to have the purity of interest in just learning for its own sake that I was after. And so then I kind of moved back from natural science, which I was very good at, and started returning to, okay, well, then I need to start taking courses in philosophy. That's how I got interested in it. In academic philosophy. Whether academic philosophy counts as satisfying the pursuit of wisdom, that's another, it's problematic, right? But
Yeah.
That's how I got interested in it. But if I was going to make a living in any realm having to do with pursuit of wisdom, it was going to be teaching philosophy as a professor. There's just no other option.
Yeah.
I mean, I had all kinds of bad jobs. I'm sure you have too. I worked in a plastics factory. I cleaned movie theaters. I did all kinds of terrible things. And I realized, well, if being a professor of philosophy is probably my best chance at devoting my life to pursuing wisdom.
That's quite the story. You know, when I was 13 years old, I think I was reading Greek mythology. I wasn't nowhere near
Greek
Bertrand Russell.
mythology. That's pretty precocious these days.
No, but it's a nice stories. I don't think I could have understood Bertrand Russell at 13 or 14.
I don't think anyone's understood Bertrand Russell, not even Bertrand Russell.
All right. Something that's been on my mind for some time now is the question of the good life, which is why we're talking about it today. Just a quick background into this. So before I moved out and got married, I lived at home and for most of my life. And when you live at home with your parents, you tend to follow the rhythms that your parents establish. But now that I'm living with my wife here, and we have to live in a way that we think is right. But before we get to the question of what is a good life meant to be, we have to understand, why is it important, or why is the question of living a good life important anyway? Why consider the question? Why not just pursue hedonism?
You know, your mention that you're just setting up a life with your wife makes me think back to when I started doing that. And for me, the main difference in how I sensed daily life from living with my parents or in a dormitory and living on my own was, I guess I would say, the second law of thermodynamics, that things were tending towards disorder. Like everything was going to be disordered. Nothing would be put back in place. Nothing would be cleaned up. Unless I developed better habits and better system and better order, everything was going to tend towards disaster. I think that's in some sense already an answer to your question. So I think that you can't live, Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living. You might say a life which isn't first examined and secondly instilled with some kind of order is hardly even a distinctively human life. In a certain sense, you don't even have agency. You're just being kind of spread out in different directions depending on how stuff strikes you, so to speak. You actually do become that behavioristic animal that my teacher Quine and B.F. Skinner believed that we were. So I think that you have to have a life that has any kind of coherence, it has to be ordered. And then if you're putting order into it, you have to say what's the best order, I think. But you asked the question, good, right? So why should we live a good life? And I think one simple answer is that we can't admire or love anything which we don't regard as good. And if you have no basis for regarding yourself and your life as good, you will loathe yourself. And a lot of people are actually in the condition of loathing themselves, and they kind of know it. And so they stupefy themselves, or Pascal said this, they distract themselves. They don't want to pay any attention to themselves. They live out of themselves. And so they're never really at home or at peace with themselves because they haven't decided whether they're good or what they'd have to do to be good, or how they'd have to change in order to be good and live a good life. For a lot of people, they rest content in other people admire me, other people like me. I've met this standard. I've been successful at this task, this stage of my life. I've moved on to the next one. Maybe I've won a competition, but that's all these things are different from good.
Yeah, I've noticed when you don't live by your own values, you don't feel you're living meaningfully, or it doesn't feel right inherently. There's something to be
although I wouldn't say my values, because why should I think my values are correct values? So they have to be more than my values. They have to be values that I have some confidence are actually truthful.
Yeah, true. Now, I'm not the first person asking this question. It seems humans have been kind of pondering this question of the good life for as long as we know. And about 2,500 years ago, there were some interesting ideas put forward in ancient Greece. People like Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus, they touched on the nature of the good life. Could you just briefly elaborate what each of those different philosophers said?
Well, I think in that list, Plato and Aristotle form a kind of pair. This game that people play, which of these doesn't belong with the other. I think Epicurus doesn't belong with the other.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting question why he doesn't belong with the other. And I would put it this way, that there are kind of different aspirations in the human heart, or that human beings show at different times. And one aspiration is to escape, right? To get me out of here. And kind of a high-minded way of doing that is by becoming godlike. So Plato uses the term theosis, which is to assimilate yourself or to become like a god. And Aristotle, at the end of his Nicomachean Ethics, says that we should strive as much as possible to make ourselves immortal by imitating the contemplative activity of God. And Socrates seemed to have, Plato also believed in cycles of reincarnation, and that the real goal of human life was somehow to break free of that. And if you broke free, you could either, maybe it was 10,000 years, or maybe for a very long time, or maybe permanently escape this cycle of reincarnation and dwell with the gods. So, and you might say, well, why is this? And it's an understandable aspiration for human beings, because nobody wants to die. Everybody wants, or it's rare, or at least it's common, that people would like to continue whatever, to see their project come to fruition, or the children to grow up, or to have more time to see beautiful things. Or it's like we never have enough. We would always like more. Right? So in some sense, we want to be immortal. So that's one view, right? And then there's the other view, which is Epicurus. And Epicurus is famous for arguing that you shouldn't fear death or care about death, because do you care that you didn't exist before you came into existence? You don't lament that, so why should you lament the fact that you go out of existence, and after you go out of existence, you won't experience anything or suffering? There's no rational basis there for fearing or caring about death whatsoever. And Epicurus is a different character, because you might want to say, well, somebody who is interested in some kind of liberation through assimilation to the divinity is interesting. You might want to call it broadly salvation, like getting out of here. This is a place of, it's the body is like a prison, Plato said, right? Whereas somebody like Epicurus, and by the way, I think Epicureanism in the real sense of the word, probably the most common worldview today, right? His view is we just manage things, and we have to avoid becoming overly disturbed. The cool character of kind of popular culture, which became common in the 60s and has prevailed, like the cowboy character or the James Dean kind of character, unruffled, cool, not passionate, not committed, detached, unconcerned about things, certainly not prone to accept any kind of pious superstitions about gods, which would instill fear in you and make you kind of living your life in fear. So this is really the spirit of Epicureanism. So it's a very, very different animal from the other two, actually. And it's not a matter of salvation, it's a matter of self-management in a way that avoids suffering until you die. You might say, well, it's kind of hopeless or bleak. Epicurus or Epicurean would say, well, at least it's not craven and captive to fear.
Yeah, I think Epicurus, he said, pleasure is the highest good, right?
Well, yeah, it's more. He's much more interested in absence of suffering and anxiety and fear than he is. He's wrongly regarded as a kind of crazy hedonist. That's not really his view. And most people we know are not really very successful hedonists.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look around the United States, for example, I mean, you have a whole bunch of people who maybe on TV idolize like kind of super slim, super beautiful, super, glamorous people, but themselves, the United States is a country of kind of overweight people who sit in chairs and watch things on television. They're not themselves wild hedonists. They're basically trying to make themselves comfortable.
Yeah, that's true. There is a misconception. People tend to think of Epicurus as a kind of hedonist and someone who pursues pleasure, but the way we understand the word pleasure might be different. It's probably different to how they understood the word pleasure.
Well, I think that's right. And look, every decent philosopher has to say that there's some respect in which we are hedonists, that we pursue pleasure and avoid pain. The real difference is whether you regard it as incidental to the good. So pleasure is a kind of byproduct of attaining the good, and it's a sign, therefore, a signal, or kind of it's an incentive also for the good, or whether it's the thing you pursue directly and maybe even instrumentalize the good in order to get the pleasure, or even not even care whether what you're doing is good or bad, so long as it has pleasure as a side effect. So that's the real dividing line for philosophers, but that pleasures and pains are pervasive and they're crucial in everything that we do. I think if you're at all realistic, you have to concede that that's so.
Now, in ancient Greek, I think the word used for the good life or to be happy is eudaimonia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What does it translate to exactly in English? Because it's hard to kind of pin down. I think happiness is not the right translation, is it?
Happiness is not the right word, but it's closer than what people are fond of saying. So there, this is kind of pseudo sophistication where people say, oh, well, of course it means flourishing, right? And of course it doesn't mean flourishing. And this is so common, everybody says this. And if you say, well, of course it doesn't mean flourishing, you say, what are you talking about? But for example, in Aristotle says this explicitly, and you can say it however you want. I will probably say eudaimonia. That's what people would, so they don't make a diphthong. Eudaimonia, that's what. But eudaimonia, say whatever you want. But there's no proper pronunciation of it. But Aristotle says that this is not applied to anything except rational creatures. But flourishing is, obviously. It comes from flower, right? Yeah. So a flower can flourish for sure. Dogs can flourish and horses can flourish. So already it's off the mark. You can tell it's not really the correct word. And there are two aspects of this term that flourishing doesn't capture. One is this aspect of success, that you really have attained what you're for, right? You've hit the mark, you have a purpose for living in the world, and you've actually succeeded at figuring out what that is and attaining it. That doesn't come into flourishing, which is a much more spontaneous suggesting word, right? And the other is what is contained in happiness, right? So I like to pause and tell people, well, okay, what's hap? So Hasmo, do you have a view? What is a hap?
I don't know.
It's an English word.
Or it is hap, you said.
So what is hap?
Happiness or hap?
Hap.
I don't know. I've never heard that before.
I know, it's kind of a wacky word, right? But think about it, mishap. Happened.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? So a mishap is something that by chance, which is bad, right? Happened is a chance event, right? So happiness really means good fortune, right? If we take
Okay.
fortune to be oh fortuna, kind of like what happens to you by, say, I can't even avoid the word, but comes to you by chance, right? And that word, that notion of you've been blessed, like blessed is much better than flourishing, because blessed does suggest this idea of you've arrived, and also something good has, almost good fortune, something has come to you outside of your control in a certain sense. Right?
Yeah, because
so
a lot of the time
this
we don't
term,
control that
eudaimonia,
yeah.
Eudaimonia really suggests some divine intervention which brings something good to you. And so it's out of your control. And people tend to think of good fortune this way, like you've got a hot streak rolling the dice, right? It's Lady Luck is helping you. Something, it's not just a string of independent events, right? It's they're lucky streaks, and you're being assisted. That's those two aspects, this attainment and aspect of good fortune, are both in the Greek word, but they're not in flourishing. So that's what the Greek word suggests. And you know what? If you actually do pause, and we're so used to thinking of it moralistically in connection with Aristotle's ethics, it actually is not that moralistic a word. And Aristotle addresses this at the beginning of his ethics.
Because I came across the definitions of living well or being well and flourishing for Eudaimonia. This is a lot more
true. I mean, he also does seem to think that equivalence would be intuitive and immediately grasped by a Greek speaker. He doesn't concede that. You're right.
Yeah, but the description you gave is.
But even doing well, like even doing well, is that in Greek has more the aspect of turning out well. Right? So it's not like I achieved my success. It's like things have turned out well.
Because doing well doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't
so
have that divine...
we also shouldn't. We shouldn't even live living well and doing things turning out well. It's closer to what's meant by that eudaimonia.
Okay. See, this is not in academic papers I've read.
Yeah, you can't believe everything that you read in academic papers.
All right. Aristotle, he defined something, a syllogism called the function argument, and he kind of related happiness or eudaimonia to the function of a human being. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Because I thought that was quite interesting.
Well, he actually takes it from Plato.
Okay.
So it's in book 1 of Plato's Republic. He's clearly adapting it. He's not unaware that he's using this argument, right? So the basic idea of this is that goodness is, I do tend to the classical view that there's a deep identity between existence and goodness, so that being and goodness are convertible with each other, right? So, and I do think it's a Platonic Aristotelian view that for something simply to exist is already for it to be good, because it's established in a form, and the form carries with it a kind of directionality. Because it's also very classical that to be good and to have a goal are one and the same thing. Right? So anything that exists just in virtue of the fact that it's established in a certain kind of directionality already is good. But things that progress, that grow, that develop over time have something they're supposed to be, right? So they're supposed to acquire something, right? And what are they supposed to acquire? You might want to say completion, perfection. One way of putting it is they're supposed to acquire the equipment or whatever else they're supposed to have in order to carry out what they're supposed to be. Right? I'm speaking in a very general way, and it may not make sense at first, but this is the way to understand virtue, that virtue as a kind of perfection of something, which makes it such that it can carry out what it's supposed to be, right? So that's in a nutshell, that's the function argument. that human beings too, like everything else, have something which we're supposed to be. And that's the function of the ergon of a human being. And that we're good human beings if we have that super added existence. I mean, simply to exist as a human being is good because you are something with the directionality of having this purpose or function. There's something that you're supposed to be, and that is good because it's goal-like, and that's what good is. But you need to acquire now equipment, stable habits, you might call them, which are such that they enable you to achieve what you're supposed to be. And then you become a good human being. Right? And then there's a third thing you need to do. Now that you are established in a form and you've acquired these virtues, which enable you to be what you're supposed to be, you actually have to put them into practice. Right? And that involves a kind of ordering and an understanding of, you might say, priorities of execution and correct relationship towards others. And then it's in that third realm, which is where eudaimonia would be. So the first is just to exist, the second is to be a good human being, the third would be to be a happy human being, someone who's achieved and put into practice what one's purpose is. Now you could see that third stage is going to involve some element of contingency. People can call this moral luck, they want to call something like that. But it may be up to us to acquire the virtues. It's certainly not up to us that we have the nature that we have. It may be up to us to acquire the virtues, but it's not entirely up to us whether we'll have propitious circumstances for putting virtues into practice in the correct ordered way. I'm not sure. Does that begin to address your question about what the function argument is? I think it's overblown, the role of the function argument. It's basically to put down that line of thought at that point in the ethics and direct the investigation for the rest of the ethics towards figuring out those two other things, what equipment we need to have, those are the virtues, and then how we put them into practice. And that's actually the reason for his attention to friendship for two full books in the Ecumenical Ethics, because it's in the context of personal relationships that these virtues get realized.
I see. Yeah, because when I read about the function argument, I came across the idea of the human function is to exercise reason, according to Aristotle. But then I thought, where does ethics come into that? Because is our function not to maybe exercise reason, but do so in an ethical way? Because we can exercise reason for mundane tasks, we can exercise reason for malicious tasks,
yes.
We can exercise reason for benign tasks as well. But
he has a pretty thick view of reason. And I'll give you an example that I've been studying a lot of Adam Smith recently, and he says that human beings have an original propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, right? And he has this very sound insight that we're meant corporately to meet our animal needs, like a human being comes, and well, you find this in Aristotle's Politics, Book 1, and Plato's Republic, that a human being comes into existence without the natural equipment for bodily sustenance, which animals have. We don't have we don't have a fur. We need to make clothing. We don't have a dedicated source of food. We need to find food. We don't even have, our soft feet can't walk around on the limestone, sharp limestone, which is our ground. We have to make shoes or sandals. We need shelter. We have to make shelter. And that these are met corporately by human beings, but they can't be met corporately by human beings except through exchanging. But if I bring you my excess, apples, and you have some excess milk, and we want to trade that, there has to be fairness to that exchange. Everybody acknowledges that, right? And we say maybe it's an equal exchange or a fair exchange, or no one feels coerced. The fact that it can be looked at by both of us and regarded as fair, that would be an example of reasonability by Aristotle, whereas using force or fraud to get you to do what I want would not be reasonable. So I'm saying that this is, we have to live in accordance with reason. It's a very rich notion, and it's a very flexible notion. And it has to do, like in any area of law where people say reasonable man's standard, was this contract contracted on terms that a reasonable person would regard as not coercive, any party towards the other. It's that notion of reason.
Okay, so there's
It's
an
not a
element
notion of reason that you might be reason. Rawls used to distinguish between reasonability and rationality. It's reasonability rather than rationality that Aristotle's interested in.
I see. Okay.
So we're the only, Adam Smith says 2 greyhounds chasing game don't ever enter into a contract about what they're meant to do. That we're reasonable and that we can enter into a contract is one and the same thing in practical matters.
Okay, that's
so it's a mistake to bring you said you're a physicist. It's a mistake to bring, say, the notion of rationality in physics to bear and say that is what he's talking about. It's not what he's talking about. He's talking about whatever we would be talking about when we're challenging someone in some matter of practice and saying that's unreasonable.
I see. It's a different connotation of reason.
Yeah.
And
now another thing that virtue ethicists tend to get wrong is that the ethics for Aristotle is just one of 3 practical treatises for him. So he wrote an ethics, he wrote an economics, which is study of the household and household management, and of course politics. So view these as like Russian dolls, nested dolls. Right? Ethics involves personal sphere of action mainly, and then there's action within the household and action within the polis, the city-state. He didn't really care so much about international affairs or empires, right? But so it's not correct that an ethics for Aristotle would be a complete account of practical reasonability or a complete morality in our sense. You have to go to the level of law. So people read Plato's Republic without reading his laws.
Mhm.
They read Aristotle's ethics without understanding that, well, anybody in his individual choices is going to be ex ante constrained already in various ways by the laws of his polis. You have to ask them what are just laws of the polis. Like, do not murder. That's going to be a law of the polis. It's not necessarily something somebody's going to come up with and he's cogitating about the function argument.
No, of course not. Okay, and speaking of ethics, how did they determine, like Aristotle and Plato and so on, they determine their ethics? Because I think Aristotle mentions things like actions are by their intentions, or to that line, where he judges the ethics of an action by the intent by which that action was made and the circumstances around that action. Is that also the case for Plato? And is that a fair way of deciding?
Yeah, I'm not sure what your question is, Hasma. Could you try to reformulate that?
So in essence, how did Aristotle decide what is a good, what is ethical virtue?
I don't think that his categories are going to match up well against ours.
Okay.
And the notion of intention is a particular one that I'm not sure that's even present in his thought. But what he does say that's perhaps most relevant to what you're asking is that an action which an impartial spectator, somebody looking at it, would judge to be virtuous, had to have 3 characteristics. First, that it was knowingly done. It was understood in the correct way. I think this is kind of like the opposite of mens rea. They say that to act in a criminal way, you have to have criminal intention. To act in a virtuous way, you have to have an intention of the right kind of virtue. Like we were just discussing an exchange in the marketplace. You have to intend to be fair. So you have to have the right understanding of what you're doing. And then it has to be chosen for its own sake. Right? There are people who choose fair actions because it will manipulate other people. There are people who follow rules because they can manipulate people by following the rules. They're they're lawful so that they can appear to be lawful and then get what they want. So you have to do it with a correct understanding, you have to choose it for its own sake. And then those two together have to be the expression of a stable character. So in the United States, we have this bumper sticker, do random acts of kindness, right? A random act of kindness could never be a virtuous action for Aristotle. It has to be an act of kindness where somebody notices it or is, the beneficiary of it and say, wow, but that's characteristic of him. That's the way that that person acts. So maybe that's the closest thing in Aristotle that answers your question.
Okay. And bringing this together now, this is kind of the crux of my the question is, should we live to be happy or to be ethical? Because one could say, take the idea of pleasure and hedonism. You think about your short-term, some probably selfish outlook and say, I want to pursue pleasure and therefore I want to be happy. But on the other hand, if you define, as you said, everything has this natural form of being good. Everything that exists is good. How do you balance that, the desire to be happy and desire to be good?
That's a very good question. It's a very deep question. I like to think of it in connection with somebody who, for example, dies in battle. So there are many young men in the history of the world who acted with honor on the field of battle, understanding that it was very likely to imply that they're going to die, right? And you might want to say, well, very often, if not typically in those cases, there's actually no option, because kind of if you break ranks or run away, you're almost certain to die. Like you have the best chances of surviving if you stand firm and you act courageously. That's usually the case, but it's not always the case, right? So then the person who doesn't bolt and run or hide, but accepts death, knowing that that brings their life to an end and they're maybe 18 years old, right? They're definitely choosing the right thing over happiness in any ordinary sense of the word. So I think that that is part of the, if you will, the moral luck, the contingency of it. Like this is just my lot. I happen to be born in the time of, let's take Second World War, and in order to, the Germans are invading my country. I'm somebody who lives in Paris. I have to defend my country. I can't not. And that's up to the gods, or God, that I'm living at this time now in these circumstances, and it's not my lot to be happy.
Yeah, I think.
So I do think you might want to say, well, there's a higher good that already, for Plato and Aristotle, they have to regard the good of the polis as higher than the happiness of the individual. So I think this is part of the problem that you get to when you think of ethics apart from politics. Because if ethics is within politics, then you might want to say the imperative is to become happy insofar as it's in my power, consistently with being a good citizen. And then that answers your question. Okay. And then you might want to say, well, why is it that why would I choose the good of the polis over my own good? And I think that would be because it would be irrational not to. I'm a part of a whole. So the part has to give itself up for the whole. And then you want to say, okay, well, but why not be irrational? Because, well, okay, so on this view, whenever you're irrational, there's consequences. Like you cannot, for example, be a coward and run away in battle and not have consequences. What you ought to do, if you want to be genuinely happy after that point and live a good life, is actually turn yourself into the commanding officer and say you ran away on the field of battle, in which case you'd probably be executed. So it's not like there's any easy out to these things. Yeah. Elizabeth Anscombe used to say that in these matters that people simplify the choice situation. They fail to think it through, and it's all its concrete detail. And then we say that the answer can be a little bit more interesting than the simplistic alternative happiness versus virtue that the problem is posed in the first place.
That makes sense to me, because when I read Aristotle and he says about the good life, and there's so there's he regards the political life as the highest form of the good life, and that makes sense because if ethics sits within politics, then you have to be engaged politically or civically. You have to be part of your society and contribute towards the flourishing of your society, and that contributes towards living a good life individually as well. Because if you're, wouldn't make sense that society wouldn't be flourishing, wouldn't be doing well when you are personally.
Well, okay, I agree with that in part, and I disagree with it in part. In part, I agree that he thinks that the good of the polis is higher than the good of the individual. And he says this at the beginning of the Ethics in a sentence that most people ignore. But he does think that insofar as it's in my power, I should prefer a life of philosophical contemplation and knowledge of the world over a life of political activism. He's pretty clear about that. A life of political activism or exercise of the grand virtues and way of a good citizen can be a type of happiness, but it's an inferior form of happiness to that of the kind of life that Aristotle lived, which was a life of leisure and just learning as much as he could.
But I suppose humans, if everyone contemplated all the time, then we wouldn't have much society. So there has to be a balance, right? Some people will have to.
Well, most people don't.
Themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Most people don't want to contemplate, actually.
Yeah. So yeah, perhaps in highlighting that people should contemplate is needed then, because there's a lack of people calling to that action.
Well, this is part of Plato's theory of the three classes and the three metals. He thought that by nature, some people were sent in that direction to be, as it were, philosopher kings. And he didn't think that we were all exactly the same in nature. But we don't have to adopt such a view. I think we can say that the talent of the equivalent for Aristotle would be more like a research professor at a university. That the talent to do that and make a real contribution in that way is actually not very widely enjoyed by people.
And what do you think are the limits of, in answering what is a good life, what do you think the limits are with the Greek philosophy? Where has it, do you think maybe it breaks down, the Aristotle's views break down, or they don't make, or they don't kind of work in some areas? Because society has changed, don't they? And ideas of the past may not work.
Well, I think Aristotle is pretty great. I mean, I don't think it really breaks down. I mean, I think there are certain things that he couldn't really explain. Like he couldn't explain why most human beings, and he himself thought that most human beings didn't achieve the purpose for which they came into existence. Now, how can that be? The other living things seem to do that. So the happiness that comes of the putting into practice of complete virtue is really pretty rare. Yeah. And he knew that and said that, but he couldn't really account for that. So it breaks down there, I suppose. I think it breaks down in dealing with suffering. I think that you mentioned you're Muslim. I'm Christian. I think the Christian way of understanding suffering and its role in our life is much more satisfactory. I don't think Aristotle had much to say about it, frankly. So maybe those are the two areas where it breaks down. But otherwise, very, very rich. There are very few books that repay careful study as much as the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle.
No, I agree. Wonderful. Lot to add from Aristotle, but I was just thinking, as time has changed and you try to apply different ideas, sometimes they don't fit in perfectly because either we don't understand properly or some ideas, the humans are always fallible.
Of course, it's very weak in the equal dignity of all human beings. Greek thought is, right? So slavery was tolerated, thought to be acceptable. There's a kind of racism also in Greek philosophy. So, I just kind of take that for granted, and we see that that's so.
Mm-hmm. And So after the Greeks, right, came the Romans, the Stoics. They kind of built on Aristotle and Plato and so on. Do you think that because the Greeks lived in city-states, but Romans had an empire, do you think that had an impact on the way they thought about the world and what the good life is?
Well, that's a good point. There's a certain kind of cosmopolitanism that's present in Stoicism. Maybe that transition was already taking place in Greek philosophy. I do think that you see that already present in the Eudaimonia Ethics of Aristotle. I wrote a paper on that, had to do with the empire of Philip, about Alexander. But I don't know. Yeah, we should probably save Stoicism for another day, because that just opens up a whole other chapter.
Yeah. Okay, a final question now.
Yeah.
Which ideas from the Greek philosopher about the good life have had a significant impact on your own conception of the good life?
So one thing that I think is really very valuable is this doctrine of the mean of Aristotle.
Yeah.
He's it's ridiculed a lot of the time because it seems like, Goldilocks, neither too hot or too cold, but just right. But I do find, in this kind of matter of practical experience, I do find in practical experience that most ways in which we go wrong are not a matter of getting it completely right or completely wrong, but a matter of some imbalance. And people don't just put things, they have wrong proportionality. And so I think that this idea of looking to a mean is a kind of very sensible and a peacemaking way, I want to say, of thinking about human relationships and our dealings with others. And, maybe we need to correct somebody, or when we have a complaint against someone, think of it more in terms of balance and proportion rather than right and wrong, actually. And another thing which I think is really very valuable, and all the time I think about this in connection with Aristotle, is this distinction between the intellectual and the moral virtues. So an intellectual virtue is a virtue which you can acquire just by instruction. And so, you can learn about professional ethics in a classroom. You can learn about rules of ethics or a legal code in a classroom. That's intellectual virtue. But moral virtue actually, and intellectual virtue just makes you good at something, like being a good at a physician or good at interpreting legal codes. Moral virtue actually changes your motivation. So you actually want certain things and exclude others, and certain things just have no purchase on you because you're kind of resistant to their allure or to their character of repelling. And that makes you just a good human being, not good at something, but a good human being. And this can't be acquired in the classroom. So I think this is a huge confusion in our society, that we think that so much more can be done just by talking and saying things and teaching that can actually be done. That character needs to be shaped in communities and through persons we admire, mentors we admire and love, and through examples of heroism and so on that we study that affect and engage our emotions. I think that that's really important. A lesson I've taken from Aristotle.
Do you have any practical tips on that moral, what do you call it, that you just mentioned now, moral virtues?
It's, yeah, I mean, I think, well, several. I mean, I think you need to have a good friend, that you become like your friend, and you need a friend who's going to help you become the sort of person that you want to be. So this, and friendship engages the emotions clearly, and your friend, by correction and by guiding you, helps you to act in the right way. So I think that's a good point. Then I think in any kind of work environment, you should seek out a mentor. And this term is so familiar now. You can approach somebody you respect in your office or firm or company or your workplace and say, look, We don't have any established institution of mentors, but I really think it's important. Like a coach. I wouldn't think of taking up a sport like tennis without actually having coach me. I mean, to teach yourself would be absurd. Nonetheless, there is also a character of self-examination, self-correction. The famous secular person is Benjamin Franklin. In his autobiography, he came up with a list of virtues that he wanted to grow in, and every evening he'd kind of go through them and check off which ones he put into practice and which ones he didn't. It's something like that, like some kind of self-referential coaching, not as good as having a real coach. So those three things, I think, having a good friend, seeking out a mentor who's a kind of coach and things that you think are really valuable, and then also some kind of serious practice of self-examination.
Okay, great. These three things you just mentioned occur in religious literature quite often as well. So that's
yes, they do.
Yeah,
they certainly do.
Yeah, which highlights the importance of religion in living a good life. Something which is not discussed today. But anyway,
A lot of the most important things aren't discussed.
Yeah, they aren't. Anyway, Dr.
So Hasma, I wish you luck in your continuing podcasts. I think it's a great idea, and I hope that our little conversation can contribute to the success of your show.
Thank you for coming on.
It's been a real pleasure.
Pleasure to have you as well.
I love the fact that you're a Muslim in Britain, and I'm a Christian in the United States, and we're having a friendly conversation. There should be more of that for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. I love talking to all kinds of people, and we can always learn a lot from each other as well.
Exactly.
And we have the same God, so that's also great. Yeah.
Good.
Anyway,
excellent.
Anyway, take care then. It's been lovely talking to you, and maybe sometime soon we can talk again.
Very good.